Every empire in history believed it was invincible until its currency proved otherwise. Rome ruled half the world, Spain controlled oceans of silver, Britain dominated global trade. All collapsed the exact same way, not by invasion, but by the slow, silent death of their money. Today, the United States stands on that same path. A $36 trillion debt, endless money printing, a shrinking dollar share, and global powers quietly preparing for a world beyond American dominance. This isn't speculation. It's the identical pattern that has toppled every superpower for 2,000 years. Now the world waits for the final question. When does the American empire take its last breath? Every empire begins with real strength, economic dominance, military superiority, and a currency the world trusts. But what almost no one realizes is that every empire also collapses through the exact same mathematical process. It isn't random, it isn't political. It is an economic sequence so precise that it has repeated 4 times over 2,000 years with 0 exceptions. At the foundation of this sequence is a hard rule. The durability of an empire is determined by the integrity of its currency. Rome's denarius began as 4.5 grams of pure silver. Spain controlled nearly 50% of global silver production in the 1500s. Britain's pound was backed by a gold reserve system that priced gold at £4.25 per ounce. The United States became dominant with the dollar backed by gold at $35 per ounce. Different currencies, same requirement: trust. The collapse always begins the moment an empire expands its obligations beyond its productive capacity. Rome stretched supply lines across 3 continents. Spain financed simultaneous wars in Europe, the Mediterranean, and the Atlantic. Britain borrowed heavily during 2 world wars, pushing debt to over 270% of GDP by 1945. And today, the United States carries $38 trillion in federal debt, equal to roughly 120% of GDP, with annual interest costs approaching $1 trillion. Once spending permanently exceeds revenue, the empire turns to the same solution every collapsing power eventually reaches: currency debasement. Rome cut silver content from 100% to 5%. Spain flooded Europe with over 300 million ounces of silver. Britain devalued the pound twice, first by 30% in 1949, then again in 1967. The US printed more than $4.6 trillion in just 2 years after 2020. The effect is identical every time: rising prices, falling purchasing power, weakening trade influence, and global diversification away from the empire's currency. When confidence breaks, there is no recovery. Investors move their reserves, trade partners shift settlement methods, and rival powers accelerate the transition to a new monetary order. This is the law of imperial economics, not theory, not speculation, but a quantifiable sequence. Strong money builds empires, weak money destroys them. And the United States is now following the exact numerical trajectory that ended every empire before it. Rome is the clearest demonstration of how an empire destroys itself from within long before any foreign army reaches its gates. At its peak, Rome controlled 60 to 70 million people, maintained supply routes across 5,000 miles of roads, and commanded the most advanced military machine of its era. But the foundation of that power was not the legions. It was the denarius, a currency trusted across 3 continents because it contained 4.5 grams of pure silver. Stability started with its money. The collapse began the moment Rome's obligations outpaced its economic output. Defending borders across Europe, North Africa, and the Middle East required a standing army of over 300,000 soldiers, each needing consistent pay, equipment, food, and logistical support. Annual military spending consumed more than half of the imperial budget, pushing Rome into a permanent deficit it could never reverse. When tax revenue couldn't keep up, leaders turned to the tool every empire eventually chooses: debasement. Nero reduced silver purity from 100% to 90%, creating extra coins without extra wealth. Caracalla cut purity to 50%, doubling the money supply while having real value. By 265 AD, under Gallienus, purity collapsed to 5%, meaning the currency lost 95% of its intrinsic value within a century. a coin that once held pure silver was now mostly worthless metal with a thin coating. The consequences were mathematical, not political. Prices surged more than 50-fold. Soldiers demanded payment in gold, not denarii. Farmers refused to exchange food for collapsing currency and shifted to barter. Tax collection broke down because citizens recognized the money had no purchasing power. Without functioning taxation, the empire couldn't fund troops. Without troops, borders crumbled. The collapse was already sealed before any invader arrived. Rome proves the pattern. Once an empire weakens its currency to solve fiscal problems, the damage is irreversible. Economic collapse triggers social instability, military decline, and eventual political disintegration. The fall of Rome wasn't caused by barbarian strength. It was caused by the empire's decision to dilute its own monetary foundation from 100% silver to 5% silver. The First Empire fell not from attack, but from arithmetic. If Rome proved that empires collapse when their currency is weakened, Spain proved that empires can also collapse when their wealth becomes too abundant. In the 1500s, Spain controlled the most lucrative discovery in monetary history, the Silver Mountain of Potosi. From this single site, more than 7,000 tons of silver, nearly half of global output for a century, flooded into Europe. On paper, Spain became the richest empire on Earth. In reality, it set into motion one of the fastest economic self-destructions ever recorded. Spain's mistake was not scarcity, but saturation. When a government injects more money into an economy without increasing production, prices rise automatically. This is not ideology, it is mathematical dilution. The sudden surge of New World silver caused the price revolution, raising prices across Europe by 500% between 1500 and 1600. What once cost 1 silver coin now required 5. Spain's wealth was evaporating in real time, even as its ships arrived filled with treasure. The deeper flaw was structural. Spain produced almost nothing domestically. Wealth flowed in from the colonies and flowed straight out to pay for manufactured goods from France, England, and the Netherlands. While silver accumulated in Spanish vaults, economic capacity remained stagnant. By the mid-1500s, Spain's rulers faced a dangerous imbalance. Enormous income from silver, but no productive base to sustain the empire. The deficit widened quickly. By 1556, Philip II inherited 36 million ducats of debt, an amount larger than Spain's annual revenue. Within a year, Spain defaulted. Then again in 1560, again in 1575, again in 1596. 4 defaults in 40 years destroyed international confidence. Lenders demanded higher interest rates or refused to lend at all. To survive, the government minted coins with reduced silver content and issued copper currency falsely valued at silver equivalents. Trust collapsed, inflation surged. Trade partners abandoned Spanish currency. Military funding evaporated. By 1648, the empire that once controlled wealth across 3 continents was already in irreversible decline. Spain proved a second universal law: money without production is poison. Too much currency inflates, too much dependence defaults, and too much borrowed power always ends the same way. Economic collapse followed by geopolitical retreat. If Rome demonstrated the danger of currency debasement and Spain revealed the danger of monetary excess, Britain exposed the final law of imperial decline. Debt destroys even the strongest empire when the currency holding it together loses credibility. At the height of its power in 1922, Britain governed 458 million people and controlled 1/4 of the planet's landmass. Its currency, backed by gold, dominated nearly 60% of global trade. The British pound was not just money. It was the spine of global finance. But the empire's vast reach came with crushing financial obligations. Britain funded its global dominance through borrowing, issuing bonds to finance wars, colonies, infrastructure, and administration. Debt remained manageable as long as the gold-backed pound guaranteed trust. That changed catastrophically in the 20th century. World War I detonated Britain's financial stability. In 1914, national debt stood near $650 million. By 1919, after 4 years of total war, it exploded to over $7 billion, a tenfold increase in just 5 years. Maintaining the gold standard became impossible. Britain suspended gold convertibility, effectively transforming the once solid pound into a fiat currency held together by political assurances rather than metal. In 1925, Winston Churchill made the fateful decision to return to gold at the pre-war exchange rate, overvaluing the pound and suffocating the economy. Exports collapsed, unemployment surged, interest rates remained high to defend the currency. The attempt failed. By 1931, Britain was forced off gold permanently. World War II delivered the final blow. By 1945, Britain's debt reached 270% of GDP, the highest in its history. Entire cities were destroyed, industrial output crippled, and the pound could no longer sustain its global role. At Bretton Woods in 1944, the world formally replaced the British pound with the US dollar as the global reserve currency. Devaluations followed, 30% in 1949, another major cut in 1967, each one eroding confidence, erasing savings, and signaling irreversible decline. By the 1970s, inflation hit 25%, and Britain requested an IMF bailout. Britain didn't fall to conquest. It fell because its currency lost the credibility that once supported a global empire. Debt, devaluation, and declining trust ended the empire long before its flag came down. If Rome built credibility through silver, Spain through abundance, and Britain through gold, the United States rose through a combination no empire had mastered before. Industrial dominance, military might, and a currency positioned at the center of the post-war world. The dollar did not become powerful by accident. It became dominant because global systems were redesigned around it. After World War II, the United States emerged with unmatched economic strength. While Europe and Asia lay in ruins, America possessed over half of global industrial output, held 2/3 of the world's gold reserves, and operated a financial system capable of funding global reconstruction. The world needed stability, and the United States provided it. The turning point came in 1944 at Bretton Woods. 44 nations agreed on a new global monetary order that anchored the world's currencies to the dollar and the dollar to gold at $35 per ounce. This made the US dollar the singular reference point for global trade. It wasn't just accepted, it became the measuring stick of value across continents. What elevated the dollar further was America's unmatched productive engine. Between 1945 and 1970, the US economy expanded at an average of 3.8% annually. Manufacturing surged and exports dominated global markets. The dollar became trusted not only because it was backed by gold, but because the US economy generated real value: steel, automobiles, machinery, technology. Military power reinforced this credibility. By 1950, the United States maintained hundreds of overseas bases, secured global shipping lanes, and guaranteed the stability of international trade. The dollar became the lubricant of globalization because America underwrote the system itself. Then came the petrodollar breakthrough. In the 1970s, the US negotiated agreements ensuring that every nation buying oil would pay in dollars, creating permanent global demand even after gold backing ended. This locked in the dollar's supremacy for generations. Unlike previous empires, America didn't rely on a single pillar. It built a system where global finance, trade, energy, and security all converged around one currency. The dollar became king not because the world chose it, but because the world had no alternative. And this unrivaled position magnified the consequences of what came next: rising debt, aggressive money creation, and global unease about the future stability of the very currency that once held the world together. The strength of the dollar was built on production, discipline, and global trust. But the moment America shifted from earning power to borrowing power, the same trap that destroyed previous empires was set. The numbers reveal a turning point so sharp it can only be described as a structural break in the nation's economic foundation. In 1980, U.S. national debt stood at $900 billion, less than the cost of a modern stimulus bill. By 2000, it reached $5.6 trillion. After the 2008 financial crisis, it surged past $10 trillion. By 2020, it hit $27 trillion. Today, the United States carries $38 trillion of federal debt, adding more than $1 trillion every 100 days. Interest payments alone are approaching $1 trillion per year, more than the nation spends on veterans, agriculture, or education. No empire in history has survived this trajectory. Debt became unmanageable, not because of one crisis, but because deficit spending became permanent. The US now runs trillion-dollar deficits even in years of economic growth. Mandatory spending, Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid, and interest consumes nearly 75% of federal revenue, leaving little room for anything else besides borrowing. When taxation and borrowing can no longer sustain obligations, the final tool emerges: money creation. After 2008, the Federal Reserve launched unprecedented quantitative easing, expanding its balance sheet from $900 billion to over $4.5 trillion. During the 2020 crisis, over $4.6 trillion was created in less than 24 months. More currency was manufactured in 2 years than in the previous 100 combined. The consequences are visible in daily life. Consumer prices rose over 20% in 4 years. Food inflation exceeded 30%. Housing costs surged beyond the reach of millions. The dollar didn't collapse overnight. It weakened gradually, eroding purchasing power with every printed dollar. Global confidence is now wavering. Nations are diversifying reserves. Trade partners are experimenting with non-dollar settlements. Central banks are buying gold at record levels while reducing dollar holdings. These are not random signals. They are the early markers of the transition from trust to caution, the same inflection point Rome, Spain, and Britain crossed before decline accelerated. America's breaking point is not theoretical, it is already measurable in trillions, and the world has begun preparing for what happens when the most indebted empire in history can no longer outrun its own arithmetic. The clearest sign an empire is entering irreversible decline is not war, recession, or political turmoil. It is the moment the world begins quietly reducing its dependence on the empire's currency. This shift never happens with fanfare. It happens slowly, invisibly, and then suddenly, all at once. The United States has already entered that stage. In 2000, 71% of global foreign exchange reserves were held in US dollars. Today, that share has fallen to 58%, the fastest decline in modern monetary history. A 13-point drop might seem small, but in global finance, it represents trillions of dollars moving away from the currency that once anchored the world. The catalysts are undeniable. Nations no longer trust that a country with $38 trillion in debt, trillion-dollar annual deficits, and aggressive money creation can maintain long-term stability. The more Washington borrows and prints, the more foreign governments hedge against the possibility that the dollar's purchasing power will erode. The global shift is accelerating. BRICS nations, representing over 3.5 billion people and nearly 1/3 of global GDP, have expanded local currency trade, launched alternative payment networks, and openly discussed a shared reserve asset. China and Russia have reduced dollar reserves dramatically while increasing gold purchases to levels unseen since the 1960s. In 2023 alone, central banks bought over 1,000 tons of gold, signaling a clear retreat from dollar dependence. Energy markets, the backbone of the petrodollar system, are changing as well. Saudi Arabia, once the dollar's most loyal anchor, now signs oil agreements in yuan, rupees, and euros. India and Russia conduct the majority of their oil trade outside the dollar. Even U.S. allies are testing non-dollar settlement systems to reduce exposure to American financial sanctions. None of this means the dollar disappears tomorrow. Reserve status never ends in a single moment. It erodes through a steady decline in trust, liquidity, and necessity. But every statistical trend points in the same direction. The dollar's dominance is shrinking while alternatives strengthen. The world is not waiting for a collapse. It is preparing for life after the dollar. And once a reserve currency begins losing ground, history shows the reversal never stops. It only accelerates. If the weakening of reserve currency status signals the world's shifting trust, overextension reveals the empire's internal strain. Rome collapsed under the weight of maintaining far-flung borders it could no longer afford. The United States now faces the modern equivalent of that same burden, scaled to a global system far more expensive and far more fragile. America maintains over 750 to 800 military bases, across more than 70 countries, a network unmatched in human history. The annual defense budget exceeds $880 billion, larger than the military spending of the next 10 nations combined. Yet these figures do not include hidden costs: veterans' care, interest on past wars, intelligence infrastructure, and long-term commitments, bringing total military-related expenses to well over $1.2 trillion annually. For decades, this system was sustainable because the world funded it indirectly by holding dollars, buying U.S. debt, and relying on American security guarantees. But as global confidence erodes and the dollar's dominance shrinks, the United States is left carrying the full financial weight of its expansive commitments. What was once supported by global demand is now increasingly financed through deficits and money creation. The wars in Iraq and Afghanistan alone cost approximately $8 trillion, including long-term care for wounded service members. These conflicts stretched the military thin, consumed decades of resources, and added enormous pressure to a federal budget already dominated by entitlement spending and rising interest costs. Today, interest payments on the national debt approach $1 trillion per year, rivaling defense itself. Meanwhile, global responsibilities continue to grow. Security guarantees in Europe, commitments in East Asia, strategic operations in the Middle East, and increasingly expensive modernization programs demand continuous funding. Yet the domestic economic base that once paid for these commitments is weakening under inflation, stagnating real wages, and structural deficits. Overextension is not measured by geography, it is measured by affordability. Rome did not fall because its legions became weak, but because the empire could no longer pay them. The United States faces the same existential equation, a global footprint far larger than its financial foundation can sustain. The Roman problem has returned, only this time, it is backed by $38 trillion in debt and a world quietly preparing for the next monetary era. Every empire that collapsed followed the same economic sequence. And when that sequence is applied to the United States, the alignment is no longer theoretical. It is exact. America rose to global dominance after 1945 with unmatched industrial capacity, overwhelming gold reserves, and a currency powerful enough to anchor global trade. For decades, this dominance seemed permanent. But the pattern that dismantled Rome, Spain, and Britain always begins the same way. Commitments expand faster than the economy that supports them. The U.S. now carries worldwide obligations that far exceed its financial base. It maintains between 750 and 800 foreign military installations, funds defense and intelligence networks costing over $1.2 trillion annually, and faces long-term entitlement liabilities surpassing $100 trillion. These promises, military, social, political, cannot be met through revenue alone. Once obligations rise above economic capacity, the pattern enters the next stage: structural deficits. Since 2001, the United States has run deficits in nearly every year, even during economic expansions. These shortfalls now exceed $1 trillion annually, pushing federal debt to $38 trillion. The government finances everyday operations through borrowing, with interest payments approaching $1 trillion per year, a sum larger than the budgets of most federal agencies combined. With borrowing reaching its limit, the nation begins the same monetary transition that every declining empire has used: currency expansion. After abandoning gold in 1971, the dollar became a fiat currency reliant entirely on confidence. Post-2008 quantitative easing expanded the Federal Reserve's balance sheet from $900 billion to nearly $9 trillion, weakening each existing dollar's purchasing power. Inflation followed. Official numbers peaked around 9%, but essential goods, housing, food, transportation, rose far more sharply. Everyday Americans feel a currency losing value long before economists acknowledge it. As purchasing power falls, global confidence deteriorates. Dollar reserves have dropped from 71% of global holdings in 2000 to 58% today, the fastest decline in modern history. Nations increasingly settle trade in local currencies, and central banks are purchasing record amounts of gold to hedge against a weakening dollar. The final stage, collapse, is not defined by destruction, but by the loss of monetary authority and global influence. The United States is already deep into the inflation stage and moving toward a confidence crisis. The pattern is no longer a warning from history. It is a real-time description of where the country stands right now. When an empire reaches the final stage of the collapse pattern, the outcome is no longer open-ended. History narrows the future into only 3 possible endgames, each shaped by the same forces that drove the decline. The United States now stands at this fork, with global confidence weakening, inflation reshaping daily life, and a $38 trillion debt load pushing the system beyond what traditional policy can sustain. The choices ahead are not creative. They are mathematical. The first endgame is controlled decline. Britain followed this path after World War II, losing the pound's reserve currency status, devaluing repeatedly, and stepping back from global leadership. The nation survived, but its influence shrank dramatically. A similar outcome for the United States would mean a managed retreat from global dominance, reduced military commitments, and a dollar that no longer dictates world trade. The second endgame is chaotic collapse. Rome experienced this when its currency lost credibility, its borders became indefensible, and internal systems broke down. For a modern economy, collapse would manifest through a rapid loss of dollar confidence, soaring inflation, a frozen bond market, and a political system unable to stabilize the crisis. It is the darkest path, rapid, destabilizing, and global in impact. The third endgame is reset and restructuring. This occurs when the old monetary system is replaced with a new architecture: gold-backed currencies, digital reserve assets, or a multi-currency world. It is painful but survivable and often becomes the bridge to a new financial era. The United States is moving toward one of these outcomes. And when the final stage arrives, it won't just reshape a nation. It will redefine the entire world order in a single generation.